I was coming from and just that general area. And then I decided I needed to get inside that theater right now because people were still coming out and yelling, you know, help, help, help. He's shooting, he's shooting.
How did you enter the theater?
Through the rear exit door, emergency exit door.
As you were going through that emergency exit door, what did you observe?
I could see trails of blood, lots amount of blood. Leading up to that back of that door, I then saw AR-type rifle, you know, a machine gun type rifle, had the magazine in it, and it was basically the barrel was pointing in a southeast direction, but is laying on the ground there.
Are you familiar with assault rifles?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with an M16?
Correct.
Does the AR style rifle look like an M16?
Yes, exactly.
What was the footing like at this area outside of the theater?
I stepped over the rifle to enter that exit door, and I almost fell down. I wasn't sure what happened until I looked down and realized it was the amount of blood that I slipped in and almost fell in. There was so much blood.
Once you got into the theater, what did you see?
There's like a small hallway, and it felt like forever going through that. And I know it's probably only feet. Once I got through to it, it opened up into the theater. On my right was the screen, and on my left was all the seating. There's some, you know, seating above and some other seating, and then you had the floor and the theater to my right, the actual screen. It was absolute. It was horrendous. It was a nightmare.
Overruled?
It looked like a war scene.
No, he's describing what he saw. This is his observation. Overruled. The objection has been overruled, Ms. Brady. Ms. Pearson, ask your next question, please.
What could you hear in the theater?
I could hear some type of alarm going off and cell phones. I remember the cell phones. After seeing what I saw, you could hear cell phones, and I wanted to pick them up and answer them. But I didn't have time, and you can't. But it was hard.
Were you aware of tear gas in the theater?
Yeah, as soon as I entered, my lips, my nose, my eyes started stinging, which is common with tear gas.
Were there people still in the theater, patrons?
Yes, there were several people in the theater, officers, patrons, victims, people who were dead.
What was going on in the theater at that time? What were people doing?
Screaming, yelling, crawling. Other people were trying to help the others that needed more help, trying to get them out of the theater. Officers were trying to help people get out of the theater by carrying, by dragging, by having them crawl.
Do you have any sense of how many officers were in the theater at that time?
I couldn't tell you. 5, 6 that I remember.
Any sense of how many patrons were still in the theater?
I want to say a couple dozen.
What kinds of injuries specifically did you see as you looked around the theater?
Lots of trauma, such as, you know, holes in legs, holes in arms. People were shot in the face, in the head. Chunks of flesh and skin were just missing. Some were absolutely unrecognizable. Just a whole variety of different types of injuries.
Did you take action yourself to try to assist the people who were in the theater?
Yes, ma'am.
What did you do?
Going back on my fire paramedic training, I decided to start checking to see if people were alive or who we could, you know, get out of here, who was actually mobile. So I started going around checking pulses and breathing and talking to people.
How did you do that? Did you walk around the theater?
Walked around the theater, assessing bodies that I saw on the ground.
Did you walk up the stairs into the stadium seating?
Yes.
What did you do to try to help the people that you were finding that could be helped?
Some, you check for a pulse and couldn't find anything. Breathing, couldn't find anything. The ones that you found, I would try and sit up or at least roll on their side so they wouldn't aspirate on their own blood and vomit and whatever else was happening. Some you just knew were dead. and there's no point in checking.
At the point that you had entered the theater, had you seen any fire trucks behind the theater?
No,
Were there any firefighters in the theater?
no.
When you were finding people that could be helped, what did you physically do with them?
So it was so chaotic. I remember checking most ones I checked were dead. I remember, of course, the one that I will always remember is the little girl. I had to step over her because I knew she was gone and continue on, which is absolutely the hardest thing I had to do. But going back on my training, I had to save the ones that I knew I could try and save. So with the absolute knowing that this was far beyond what we're capable of, I exited the theater and I got a hold of Sergeant Redford. I said, we need to start getting these people to the hospital now.
And what did you do?
I went to my patrol car. I emptied it out what I could to make more room for as many people as I could put in there. I got into it. I drove it up to the rear of the exit, and I started loading people into my car.
Who do you recall the kinds of people that you put into your car on this trip?
A couple of them, yes. On the first trip, yes.
How many trips did you ultimately make?
4.
And 4 trips to hospitals?
4 trips to hospitals.
Did you go to more than one hospital during that?
2 separate hospitals.
How many people did you transport?
6.
So going to the first trip, how many people did you take on the first trip?
2.
Did another officer go with you as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Please describe the passengers, the people that you took to the hospital on that trip.
One was a female who appeared to be shot in the face and possibly the chest, who was unconscious, non-responsive, covered in blood, chunks from her body missing. We put her in the back seat along with Officer Natasha Cabouet, and then we put a male in the the front passenger seat next to me, who appeared to have been shot to the head too. He had a bandage around his head and he's covered in blood and dripping blood.
Was he associated with the woman in the back?
He was either her husband or boyfriend at the time. I'm not quite sure. But yes, they were together.
Once you got them in the car, what did you do?
I left the parking lot to go to a hospital. I aired to dispatch whether I got across or not. I have 2 critical patients en route to Aurora South.
Now, is Aurora South also known as the Medical Center of Aurora?
Correct.
Do you know which? Is one of them an older name and one a newer name?
For 15 years, I've always called Aurora South. That was just what was taught to me, and that's what it's always been in my entire career.
But it's the same hospital?
It's the same hospital, yes.
During the trip to the hospital, what was going on in your car?
The female was starting, she would breathe and then stop breathing. And I would yell at her just to hang on. We're almost there. Stay with me. As Officer Cabouet attended her, I could hear her, breathe and then stop breathing. And we would both yell at her and try to keep her going. The male that was sitting next to me kept saying he needs to go back. I need to go back. I need to go back. He was like, I need to get my daughter. My daughter's still there. My daughter's still there. And that's when it hit me that the little girl that I walked over is probably theirs. So at one time he tried to jump out the car as I'm running code, lights and siren to the hospital, because he wants to go back to get his daughter. So I have to not only drive, now I have to grab him by his shirt and hold him in from jumping out of the car, knowing the entire time that I just wanted to tell him she's gone, but I couldn't do it. So we got to the hospital, and we unloaded the patients. And I let them know. I believe I was the first one there. I can't say for sure. I didn't see any other officers or any other patrol cars. I told them, you're going to have a lot more gunshot victims coming in, so be prepared.
Did you learn who the woman was who was in the back seat
Yes.
of your car?
Later on.
What was her name?
Ashley Mosier.
And the person who was in the front seat, did you learn his name?
I never got his name.
After you finished dropping the first 2 people off at Aurora South, what did you do?
I aired on the radio to Sergeant Redford, asked if we had more patients need to be transported. He said, get back here now. So I proceeded code, lights and siren, back to the theater.
Were more people put in your car?
Yes, I drove back to the back of the theater on the east side again, and 2 more people were loaded up into my car, both in the back.
Do you recall anything about their injuries that you observed?
I just recall them being covered in blood and moaning and screaming, and that's it.
Do you know what gender they were?
I don't know race, color, creed.
Were you
Sex.
did you have anyone else with you on that trip?
No, ma'am.
Where did you go?
Aurora South again.
When you got to the hospital, did you drop them off?
Yes, I did.
What did you do next?
I tried to get back on the radio, but it was so busy now, I decided to go back to the theater in case I needed more. I went back to the back side of the theater again.
Did you pick up another person to take to the hospital?
Yes, I did.
Do you know who that person was?
Yes, ma'am.
What was his name?
Caleb Medley.
Can you describe his condition, what you observed about him?
He had significant amounts of trauma to his face. He was unrecognizable. I thought he was gone. But then I could hear him breathing, so he's not gone. Covered in blood, moaning, gurgling on his own blood, aspirating.
Where did you take him?
I took him to University Hospital.
Why did you go to University rather than Aurora South?
I figured by now Aurora South was being inundated by patients and victims, so I figured we need to start putting them someplace else so they can get the proper treatment.
Did you talk with him while you were driving to the hospital?
Yes. He made some of the most awful noises I've ever heard. I could tell he was dying. I could tell he was gurgling on his own blood. And then he would stop, and then I heard nothing. So then I yelled at him. And I yelled at him, "Don't fucking die on me. Don't fucking die on me." And he would start breathing again, and I would start breathing again. And I would continue. And then he would stop again. And then I would yell at him, "Don't fucking die on me. We're almost there." And he started breathing again. And then I got to the hospital.
When you got to the hospital, did somebody help you unloading him?
Yes. University was already ready. Somebody must have let them know that this was happening. And they were outside waiting. They had gurneys and everything else. So me and some of the hospital staff, I believe, unloaded him and put him on a gurney. And I headed back.
When you got back to the theater, did you make another trip?
I did.
Do you recall anything about the last person that you
No,
transported?
just covered in blood. Really wasn't saying anything. Was quiet. Wasn't quite sure. Just laying in the back of the seat. Just covered in blood. Not sure what the injuries were.
What hospital did you go to?
University again.
Once you got this person to the hospital, what did you do?
I aired on the police radio to Sergeant Redfern if he needs me to come back. Are there any more patients? Excuse me. And at that time, he said, "No, I think everybody's been transported." So I decided to stay on scene at University, take command and control over there. I was only off there for quite a while, and patient after patient after patient just kept coming in.
Could you see how they were arriving?
Some were arriving by police car. Some, I think one arrived by ambulance. There's even one that arrived by our jail van, the Aurora City jail van, and others by like personal vehicles.
Do you know how many people you saw arrive at University Hospital? How many victims from this shooting?
25 to 30.
When you were finished transporting vehicles, what was the condition of your police car?
Sustained.
When you were driving to the hospitals, were you aware of, were there any particular sounds that you heard in your car?
Yes.
Hold on, there's an objection. What's the objection? Yes. The objection is sustained.
Do you know how long you were at University Hospital?
It's about 9 or 10 in the morning.
Thank you, officer. I don't have any more questions.
Is there any cross-examination, Ms. Brady? It looks like the jury has some questions, sir. If you could give us a moment, please.
Yes, sir.
All right. Would counsel please approach? All right, officer, there are some questions that the jury has submitted. I have modified a couple of them, but I find that with those modifications, they are appropriate under the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law. First, you said that you don't know what happened to the backpack, right?
To the back? No, I do not.
Okay. The next question is, did you report the backpack to anyone?
Yes, I did.
And then lastly, do you know whose clothes they wear?
No, I do not.
Any follow-up questions, Ms. Pearson?
Officer Grizzle, once you saw the backpack and the contents of it, was there anything about it that looked like it was involved in this case or in this
No,
crime?
no, it did not. It was like a backpack full of clothes, but I wasn't sure, so I just backed off anyways.
Thank you.
Any follow-up questions from you, Ms. Brady? All right, may this officer be released from his subpoena? Any objection, Ms. Brady? All right. Sir, you're subject to being recalled. for testimony later, okay?
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Call your next witness, please.
The people call Sergeant Stephen Redfern.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
All right, please be seated. Could you please tell us your full name?
Yes, my name is Stephen, Stephen. My last is Redfern, Redfearn.
Ms. Pearson, you may proceed.
Sergeant Redfern, how long have you been employed at the Aurora Police Department?
A little bit over 15 years.
And how long is that, have you worked in law enforcement prior to working at the Aurora Police Department?
Yes.
Where was that?
Prior to coming to Aurora in '99, I was a police dispatcher at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, and prior to that was a police cadet and an explorer.
What did your duties consist of on July 20th of 2012?
On that night, I was assigned as a supervisor to, it's called the Summer Task Force. And what that was two teams of officers who were focusing on some of the crime areas, the higher crime areas that tend to pop up during the summer months. So it was kind of an anti-crime type team.
What hours were you working?
The swing shift, so from 3 p.m. until 1 a.m.
So had you come on duty at 3 p.m. on July 19th, and were you due to get off at 1 a.m. on July 20th?
Yes.
Were you asked to respond, or did you hear a call to respond to the Century 16 Theater?
I did.
What was the nature of the call?
The call had come out that there was a shooting at the theater.
And were you getting any more information than that before you arrived?
I was not too close. I was in the northern part of the city, so it took me a couple minutes to get there. The only information I was receiving was that the dispatcher said that people were still shooting in Theater 9, and then the first officers had arrived and were calling out that they were at different locations with gunshot victims.
How did you approach the theater? What direction did you come from?
I came south on Sable from Alameda, and I came in the east entrance to the theater off of Sable. I think it's Center Point. And then I drove over a curb and entered the parking lot.
Did you go to the front or the back of the theater?
I went to the back, the east side of the theater.
When you got to the back of the theater, what did you see?
When I got to the back of the theater, there were 3 Aurora police officers that were with a handcuffed subject who was on the ground, and they were in the process of either had already started or were starting to get him to a standing position when I pulled back there.
Do you recall who those officers were, or do you know who they were?
To the best of my recollection, it was Officer Blue, Sweeney, and Oviatt.
When you came into the back of the theater, was there anything else going on behind the theater at that time?
At that time, that was the main thing that I focused on. There was not a whole lot going on at the back. I was hearing radio transmissions that there was a lot going on inside and at the front, but initially back there there wasn't a lot going on.
Did you see anybody who appeared to have been shot behind the theater at that time?
At that time, no. Subsequently, yes, but initially I did not.
When you saw officers Oviatt, Sweeney, and Blue, where were they behind the theater? And if I could have up People's Exhibit 4740. And then there's a pointer behind you, and there's a wireless mic there as well, which I think we'll need to turn on. If you can point to where you came in.
I don't see the entrance here, but the entrance I drove in would have been just kind of on the top of the TV, if you would. I came south on Sable, I pulled in, and then I drove over some kind of curb here and then drove right back to about this location, so fairly close to the rear exit here of the theater.
Where did you see officers Oviatt, Sweeney, and Blue?
Right in that area, right about here, there was a white vehicle parked, and they were parked, they were on foot in that area to the rear of the vehicle. So all pretty close to this exit. There's a dumpster there. It's all taking place right in that area.
You can go ahead and have a seat. When you first got there, now you said that the person was on the ground. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I remember.
Did they get the person up?
They did.
It's hard to get into these seats with your utility belts on, aren't you? Did they get him up on his feet?
They did.
And what did they do with him?
They placed him into the back seat of my police car. I remember them removing some items of clothing and things like that from him, and then they put him into my police car.
What happened next? Once he was put into your police car, I guess, first of all, let me take a step back. When he was put into your police car, did you stay in your police car?
For a short time, for a couple minutes, yes, I did, and he stayed seated in the back.
Did you have any conversation with him when he was in your car?
No.
When you said for a couple of minutes, what did you do after a couple of minutes?
During those minutes or after? I'm sorry.
Well, during those minutes, what were you doing?
I initially was doing some work on my laptop computer, my MDC, mobile data computer. I had received an identification card or driver's license that appeared to belong to the person that they had detained, and I initially tried to look up some information on him to see what I could find.
Did you do that?
I did.
Were you able to find any kind of information?
Yes, I ran a routine clearance check through the crime computers, and then I also looked in our Aurora Police in-house record system, if you will, and I pulled up both his name and his address in our in-house system.
Do you recall what that address was?
I don't remember the apartment number, but it was an apartment building at 1690 Paris Street in Aurora.
Did the address that you were pulling up in your computer match the address on the driver's license that you had?
I believe so, yes.
Was there any information that you were finding at that point that was associated with that address?
Yes.
What was that?
When I pulled up a history of calls, so calls for police service at the 1690 Paris address, I noticed that there had been a noise complaint called in at that same address that was on the ID within the prior hour. So I don't remember the exact time, but it was about an hour or less prior to arriving at the theater. Someone had called in a loud music complaint at the apartment that at that time I believed to belong to the suspect.
Did that information concern you?
It did.
Why?
I'm not really sure why at the time it concerned me. It just didn't seem right to me. That's the best way I can put it. The fact that at the time we believed that the suspect that the officers had just handcuffed was a suspect in the shooting, the fact that there was a pending or a recent loud music complaint at his same apartment seemed like more than a coincidence to me. It might just be that sixth sense that you get after a while as a police officer, but at the time I just remember thinking there's something not right about that.
While you were sitting in the car during this couple of minutes, what could you see going on outside your police car?
Initially, there wasn't a lot of activity going on, but after, and time's a little hard for me, exact times on the timeline of things, but within a few minutes or less, people started to come out of the rear area by the theater.
What did these people look like?
Initially, and I exited my car and contacted, there was a group of about probably 10 folks who had come out of the theater. There was a couple little girls who had been separated from their parents that were upset. And there were definitely some employees that had come in that group. And I specifically remember one gal, African-American gal, who, when I walked up to her, she had a great deal of blood on her head and some brain matter. I shined my flashlight to see if she was injured, and she was not. And at that time, I realized that those substances had come from someone else.
When you got out of your car, was the suspect left sitting in your car?
Yes.
Was anybody with him?
Yes, Officer Oviatt, I either asked him to or he volunteered to stay and keep direct eye contact on the suspect.
Was the suspect in the back seat of a car?
Yes.
When you're in the back seat of a police car, can you open the doors?
No.
When he was first put into your car, did he have ballistic gear on?
He had some. On the lower extremities, I believe the officers had removed what appeared to be some sort of ballistic stuff, from the upper body, but when he was in the back of my car, he still had some sort of items on his lower extremities.
Do you recall him being taken from your car and searched again beyond what you, or did you ever see him, how many times did you see him be searched?
The initial time as I arrived, when he was, he being the suspect, taken up off the ground, he was then put in my car, and then the decision was made to take him out of my car again and then remove more of the outer garments that he was wearing.
Do you know how long a period of time that was between when he got in your car versus when he was taken out of your car?
Exactly no, but I can tell you that during that time when I was doing some things on my computer, that is the time when the suspect's actions made me a bit nervous, and that took a couple, 2 to 5 minutes at best. During that 2 to 5 minutes, the suspect was moving around and things like that, so I told the officers to pull him out of my car again and take the rest of the garments that he was wearing off.
When he was sitting in the back seat, could you observe him? Could you see him?
Yes.
What did you observe about his demeanor?
He was moving around quite a bit. Obviously, I don't know why, but he was not sitting still. He appeared to be looking all around. At one point, I recall looking back, and the suspect seemed to be trying to see what I was looking up on my computer, and just kind of looking all around and moving more than I was comfortable with.
Was the way he was behaving consistent with other people who've been arrested that you've had in your police car over the years?
Not really. Most people that, when they're put in a police car, will just sit there and, for whatever reason, they're in the car. But most of the time, they'll, A, either converse with you, or B, just kind of sit there and wait to see what's going to happen next.
And how was his behavior not consistent with what you normally see?
He was moving around more. He definitely was looking out the kind of the back window and the side window from the door where he was seated. Seemed very interested in what was going on around where we were.
So he was taken out of the car and more of his items were taken off.
Yes.
Were you involved in assisting to take off any of the other ballistic gear that he had on?
No, I think I was still doing some things on the computer. I told the officers to pull him out of the car, take the rest of that stuff off. I remember, I think it was Officer Blue asking, "Are you sure he'll be down to his underwear?" And I said, "Yes, take all of that stuff off and then put him back in."
And was he put back in your car in his underwear?
Yes, he may have had some sort of undershirt on. I don't remember clearly, but all of the ballistic-looking clothing had been taken off.
During the time that this is occurring now, in the second search, what is happening behind the theater?
At that time is when that first group of folks, about the 10 people that I contacted, came out. Once we determined that they were not, in our eyes, involved or as suspects, we sent them away, and then a short time later, officers began to bring victims out of the rear of Theater 9.
The victims that you saw being brought out of the theater, what did they look like?
There was all of them were injured. I believe, based on radio transmissions and things like that, that everyone who was able to walk on their own, the majority of them had exited the front of the theater. And so the people that were being brought out to where I was were all people who needed help from police to get out. They were not able to do so on their own.
At some point, did you get information, or did you hear any statements the defendant made to any police officers when he was sitting in the back of your car?
No, not directly.
Was information relayed to you about a statement involving explosives that could be tripped at his apartment?
Yes.
When you learned that information, what did you do?
When information was relayed to me about the potential that there might be some sort of explosives at the Paris Street address, I believe I telephoned, not radio, one of the sergeants with the narcotics unit. I had previously noticed that there were some of the plainclothes detectives with the narcotics section there, and I figured they might be a good resource to actually go to the Paris Street address to start some surveillance on that address because we just didn't know what all was going on yet.
By the time that you learned this information, had you learned about the noise complaint?
Yes.
Did the way that you viewed the information about the noise complaint change once you learned of this statement regarding explosives?
What's the relevance? Why don't you approach? Okay, the objection is overruled, but actually sustained. And Ms. Pearson, you should proceed as we spoke about here at the bench.
When you had learned of the noise complaint at the apartment, and when you learned that there was information about possible explosives, did that drive your decision to ask somebody to go and look at the apartment?
Yes.
Now, the defendant was sitting in the back seat of your car. Did you transport him to the jail?
I did not.
Was he taken right away to the jail?
No.
Why was that?
Honestly, at that point, shortly after that first group of folks I talked about came out, we were so inundated with severely injured folks back where we were that at that time the defendant was the least of our priorities. He was handcuffed and secure in a car. Our focus turned more to dealing with the injured folks at that time as opposed to quickly getting him to the police department. It just wasn't a priority.
Do you know how long he sat in your car?
I don't. A lot of the times I have to estimate just because there was so much going on, but he was probably back on scene for at least 30 minutes in my car before we took him to the police station.
Is that unusual for a normal circumstance?
Yes, especially on a crime where you have a victim. A lot of times the priority is, once the suspect's apprehended, is to just get them out of the area, get them to the police station or the jail. So in this case, yes, that was unusual.
Was there anything about this circumstance that was normal, that would involve using normal things that you would do in a call?
No, this was the most abnormal call for service I've ever handled.
Did you end up going into the theater?
Briefly, more so into the back hallway area, but I never fully went into the theater.
At some point, was a decision made to transport victims in police cars?
Yes,
Do you know how that came about?
I do.
What was it that caused you to do that?
After probably 12 to 15 injured people had been brought out by officers and set down on the sidewalk area, we'd made probably 8, 10 requests via radio for ambulances, for paramedics, and none of those were answered. We had one paramedic that was with us, and he was a police officer, and thankfully he was able to evaluate some of the injuries, but we were not getting ambulances, and we had requested numerous times, And quite honestly, out of desperation of watching what I thought was watching some of these people passing in front of our eyes, I conversed with Officer Grizzle and said, let's start putting some people in police cars. I told him to go get his car. He did that, and that began kind of a process of taking all of the folks that we had in the back, putting them in cars, and sending them to hospitals.
Was his the first car that was used to transport a victim to the hospital?
Yes, he had an unmarked police car that night, and I believe we were able to put someone in the back, and then he made subsequent trips back to the theater.
Did you stay in the back of the theater once he had left for the hospital?
Yes, I ended up kind of supervising the evacuation of these victims. Once the officers would bring them back to us, we tried to evaluate who needed to go first. And then I was wearing latex gloves because I was helping load a lot of these people into the cars. And as we sent people to the hospital, I, with my pen on my latex glove, would make a tick to which hospital we sent them to. So after, I think, about 8 or 9 people we had sent to Aurora South Hospital, I realized that was a lot, and I started telling people to go to university.
How many people did you load into cars in the back of the theater?
I'm not sure, but I physically helped at least 10 probably. Police cars are not designed for that sort of activity, so especially some of the more injured people that couldn't help us help them, it took 4 or 5 officers to load some of those folks into the back of those cars.
Were vehicles besides police cars used?
The last victim that we transported from the back, I believe we put into a crime lab truck that had arrived. At that point, to me, it didn't matter what we put them in. So we used all police cars, where I was at least, and then the crime lab vehicle.
While you were behind the theater, did you see any firearms?
Yes.
Where did you see them?
There was what appeared to be a Glock pistol on the roof of the white sedan that was parked behind there that we had believed was the suspect's. There was a handgun in the passenger side door pocket of the suspect vehicle. I could see it sticking out of the door pocket down on the door of the passenger seat or passenger side. And then I saw a long gun. It looked like a rifle or a shotgun laying at the entryway from the back where we were to the hallway leading into the theater.
Did anybody disturb any of those guns? Anybody pick them up who shouldn't have picked them up?
Not that I saw. I think everybody wanted to leave them where they were, and I didn't see anybody doing anything to those.
When you had heard the statement about there possibly being IEDs at the defendant's apartment, did you request that the bomb squad respond?
Yes, I very early on requested the bomb squad to actually respond to the theater.
Was that because of that statement, or was it because of some other reason?
Well, it was both because of that statement, which was obviously concerning. I thought that if maybe there was devices at his home, there could easily be in the vehicle, and then just my knowledge of other incidents where devices have been left to harm first responders and such. It was, I just wanted to have the bomb squad there in case we did find something that was of that nature.
How long did you stay behind the theater that night?
I stayed behind the theater until the last victim was transported. Everyone else that was remained on scene was deemed to be deceased. And once we got the last gentleman into the crime lab truck, I believe shortly thereafter I went around to the front of the theater where the command post was being set up and assisted in some other matters there.
Do you know how long it took to transport all of the victims away from the scene?
I don't. It took a while. I would estimate a half an hour, but I could be way off. The timeline for me is not very clear, and I apologize.
Did the circumstances at this incident make it harder to keep track of time than at other crime scenes you've responded to?
Sustained.
Was it difficult to keep track of time that night?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Do you have any cross-examination, Mr. King?
3 minutes?
Go ahead.
2 questions, Sergeant. Thank you. Sergeant, when you responded to the theater, you went directly to the back of the theater. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you did so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because Officer Sweeney had radioed for a car in the back.
Yes, almost the exact time I was pulling into the area, Officer Sweeney relayed via the radio that he needed I believe he said marked police car to the back of the theater, so I went there.
Now, I think you said in direct testimony that listening to the radio traffic, it seemed like there were other officers responding to the front of the theater, but when you went to the back of the theater, the only officers that were there were yourself, Oviatt, Blue, and Sweeney, correct?
That's the way I recall, yes.
Now, with regard to the search of the defendant, well, first, when you arrived, shortly after you pulled up there, the other officers were getting the suspect off the ground into a standing position. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it was at that point that he was placed in your car, right?
Shortly thereafter, yes.
And you said that he had been searched partially at that point on his torso area. The clothing had been taken off, but not the rest of his outfit.
Correct. And again, I wasn't involved in that, but I was observing some of it, so that's, to the best of my knowledge, that's correct.
Sure. And so while he's seated in the back of your car, he doesn't have any of the ballistic gear still on his torso, but he does have the leggings part on.
That's how it appeared from where I was seated, yes.
And when he was removed that second time, that's when the officers took the rest of the clothing off of him.
Yes.
And do you recall how they took it off of him? Were they able to take it off, or did they have to cut it off?
I don't know. I was still working, I believe, I'm certain that as they took him out of my car, I was still seated in the driver's seat and I think looking at the computer, because I specifically remember just hollering to them saying, hey, get him out of the car and take that stuff off. And I don't think I got out of my car, so I can't tell you accurately how they took it off.
And you're aware that when he was subsequently searched after being taken out of your car, that there were no weapons that were found on him, right?
I don't think they found any, no.
Okay. And you didn't find any weapons in the back of your car, did you?
No.
1 minute, Judge?
Yes.
That's all I have. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Pearson, do you have any redirect? Sir, it looks like the jury may have some questions, so give us just a moment, please. Thank you. Would counsel please approach? All right, Sergeant, there's a question, actually it's a couple of questions that the jury has submitted, and I have found, based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, that they are appropriate. The first question is, in your experience as an officer, after the defendant's gear was off and he was sitting in the car, was his demeanor similar or different than other defendants you have observed? And then the follow-up is, how was it similar and different to what you observed in the past with other defendants? I can read it again if you need me to.
No, I'm just trying to think best how to answer that. That's, for me, a tough question, just because I'd never dealt with a situation such as this, just the enormity of the situation. So it's hard to compare, for me, it's hard to compare the demeanor of this defendant to others because I'd never dealt with a defendant or a suspect that had been involved in something like this. What struck me about this individual was the desire, it appeared on his part, to be very concerned with what was going on outside of the car. And as we were dealing with victims, the suspect was very interested, it appeared, based on turning around and looking what was going on as to what was happening. Over 15 years, I've arrested a lot of people, and their behaviors vary drastically depending on a lot of factors. So, long answer, but I can't give you a specific answer on that and how he was necessarily different.
Okay, any follow-up questions based on those questions, Ms. Pearson? Any follow-up questions from you, Mr. King?
No, thank you.
All right, may the sergeant be released from his subpoena? Any objection, Mr. King?
Judge, we're again asking that he remain on call should testimony be needed later.
All right, thank you. You're subject to the defense's subpoena, and you may be recalled, okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, members of the jury, it's almost 12:20, so I think it makes sense to take our lunch break. Is it okay with you if we take 1 hour since we're having a short day today? Anybody not okay with that? Okay, great. Are the parties okay with taking 1 hour? Yes. All right, let's take 1 hour. Please follow all of my advisements. All of them apply during the lunch break. All of them are extremely important. Enjoy your lunch. I'll see you back here at 1:20. The record should reflect the jury has exited the courtroom. Is there anything we need to talk about at this time from the people, Ms. Pearson? Everyone may be seated, by the way. Anything we need to talk about on behalf of the people?
Just briefly, Your Honor, we just wanted to confirm with the court that officers who've been released from their subpoenas are okay to watch the trial from now on and are exempt from sequestration.
Is there any objection to that?
No objection for officers that have been released from their subpoena, none at all.
Okay, all right. So that request is granted, or the request for clarification is granted, and so yes, that is correct. Officers who have been released not only from your subpoena, but also from any subpoena by the defense, they are no longer subject to the sequestration order. Okay? Anything from the defense at this time, Mr. King?
No, thank you.
All right, enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
All rise.